The latissimus dorsi muscle begins between the scapula and the humerus. It also attaches to the interosseous membrane, which is located between these bones internally. Its tendons then pass under the inner ankle and go under the navicular bone. The navicular bone is precisely its position, forms the arch of the foot. If the navicular bone drops down, then the arch of the foot flattens along its length. And it is the tone of the posterior tibial muscle that determines in which position the navicular bone will be. If the posterior tibial muscle loses its tone, then the navicular bone drops down. The posterior tibial muscle stretches, and the navicular bone drops down, flattening the arch of the foot. In addition to it, the posterior tibial muscle also attaches to the cuboid and cuneiform bones. Therefore, it also participates in the formation of the transverse arch of the foot. So it turns out this muscle, it practically forms the arch of the foot itself. Here it is located between the small toe bone and the big toe bone. This is all the space it occupies. It attaches to the interosseous membrane, that is, the deepest innermost layer of muscles on the shin. Above it is the finger flexor muscle, the big toe flexor muscle, the cambeloid muscle, and the acromial muscle. And the deepest layer is the posterior tibial muscle. Its drying goes on, here again, under the inner ankle and attaches to the muscles of the foot arch. The arch of the foot is a fairly flexible structure, so it is formed by several bones at once. The foot itself, as you can see, is formed from a fairly large number of small bones. And all this is necessary for everything to be mobile. Between all these bones there are joints. And in the process of stepping, since quite a large load comes to the foot, that is, the entire weight of the human body falls on the foot. And to withstand all this, a special construction was created. That is, the very position of the bones and the work of all the joints between all these bones and the work of all the muscles is done in such a way as to withstand a sufficiently large load as effectively as possible. Not only when walking. When the body weight, for example, falls on one leg and the load increases many times, but also when running, for example. And everything is done in such a way as to also amortize this blow, so that the foot strike during walking or running is not harsh, so that it does not pass upwards, so as not to knock out the kidneys, for example, or not to experience other unpleasant sensations. And therefore here, well, it turns out that the foot springs under the load on it. But all this happens with the proper functioning of the muscles, with the proper functioning of the joints. The posterior tibialis muscle, it supports the shin bone and practically holds all the small bones in a certain position. But, of course, it doesn't do it alone. It does it together with some other muscles, which we will talk about later. But the major role in this process of stabilizing the foot bones is played by the posterior tibialis muscle. Everything starts with its weakness. Everything else turns off when it stops working. The plantar aponeurosis is shortened. When it is weak, instability of the metatarsal bone occurs. It starts to wobble. Because another function of the posterior tibial muscle, besides forming the arch of the foot, is also the stabilization of the metatarsal bone. And if the metatarsal bone is not stabilized, it starts to wobble in this joint between the head of the metatarsal bone and the tibial muscle. The tibial bone starts to wobble, and this in turn causes instability of the knee. That is, gradually this leads to arthritis of the knee joint. But also instability arises in the ankle joint, and with this the position of the tibia changes. It shifts slightly forward, and this, in turn, causes a limitation of movement, primarily bending and the work of the flexors of the big toe and all other toes. This causes a shortening of the stride during walking, during running, which in turn, for example, if this happened on one side, will change the length of the stride. One step will be longer, the other shorter, and this will already cause ascending disorders, for example, different volume, different strength, different tone of the calf muscles. This is one of the reasons why it develops. And the mechanism of walking itself, it is arranged in such a way that the gluteus maximus muscle in normal, it should strain as much as possible with each step to hold all this together. It should strain at the right moment, relax at the right moment. But this will only happen when there is a good enough flexion in the ankle joint during the step. Flexion is this movement. Flexion of the foot, it is called. This reverse movement, it is called the flexion of the foot. And during the step, precisely during the flexion of the foot, during the simultaneous work with the rear calf muscle, at this moment, the front calf muscle and the extensor of the big toe are working. If during walking there is insufficient movement, flexion of the foot, then the rear calf muscle cannot fully activate, cannot fully work. And in the end, under some load, that is, for example, during running, let's say, or during prolonged walking, it gets injured. Most often it's dryness, but it happens that the muscle itself. This happens when during a step or during a run, the body is transferred to an unbent, in such a way foot. And at this moment, the gastrocnemius muscle is not in tone. The calcaneus is not held by anything, and it shifts. Down, here, the gastrocnemius muscle should hold it, but in this position it cannot create maximum load. When, for example, you run and transfer the weight of the body to the foot, not bent, but in such a way, and due to the displacement of the talus bone downwards, a trauma of the gastrocnemius muscle occurs, and it just gets injured and just stops working. Then, since we walk a lot, the muscle doesn't have time to recover, and eventually it just gradually begins to atrophy. Then, after the muscle has turned off, the stretching of the ligament itself begins. That is, the loosening of the foot arch will not happen immediately. First, the ligament will hold all this together, but after some time, without muscle, without good tone of the calf muscle, the ligaments also will not withstand and will begin to stretch. And here is where what will happen. All these little bones will just start to disperse. That's how they hold themselves in the form of such an arch. But with the weakness of the ligamentous apparatus and the weakness of the muscles, they will simply disperse to the side. An important condition for the restoration of the gluteus maximus muscle, in addition to exercises for it, is that it works with every step. And this will happen when the foot is well flexed with each step. And even if you look at the structure of the metatarsal bone, it is made in such a way that the load on it comes exactly at such an angle, with sufficient flexion. If this happens at such an angle, it will also in turn cause trauma to these joints, among all these bones. Trauma to the ligamentous apparatus, and trauma to the attachment points of the plantar fascia, muscles attached to the metatarsal bone, which in turn will be the cause, for example, of heel spur or something similar. The isolated movement of the gastrocnemius muscle, if it is isolated, it is like this. That is the movement inside the foot. In this case, the gastrocnemius muscle works in isolation, and it is this movement that we will use in her training. Before training this muscle, it is necessary to remove the damaged parts of this muscle. That is, if it is already not working, if the arch of the foot is flat, if there is pain in the calf muscle, it will appear. This is also a sign. It can, of course, also be present with some other disorders. A strained and shortened calf muscle. But very often this happens with weakness of the posterior tibial muscle. Muscle when the fibula becomes unstable. The function of maintaining it tries to take over the calf muscle, tries to stabilize in this joint between the head of the fibula and the tibia. And the calf tries to hold the fibula. Because of this, it is strained, becomes sick because it tries to perform not its function. So the first thing to do is to remove all the trigger points of the very back tibialis muscle. It is impossible to approach it through the gastrocnemius muscle from here, because everything is closed here. Here is the gastrocnemius muscle, the comb muscle, then the flexor of the finger, the flexor of the big finger. The only place from where it can be reached is here, from this side, from the side of the humerus. Here you can crawl up to it, this part. You can act on this part. This is exactly the place between the acromial muscle and this very back big toe bone. That is, under such an angle, such an impact on, it works out all the diseased parts of the very back calf muscle. Another method. You can do it through the calf bone with the help of vibration. That is, hit it in this way. This vibration will be transmitted to the calf bone. Muscle, the rear one, calf muscle. But it's even better to combine this vibration with foot movement. That is, you move your foot simultaneously, making such a movement inward and outward. And at the same time, you tap on the back of the calf bone. You don't need to tap hard. That is, with about the same force you tapped on the pound. Here, if you tap hard, it won't be better. It will only be worse. Here. Now let's move on. After you've removed all these diseased points, it's better to start from this. Spend 1 day on what you've done to these points. Then, start the exercises on the latissimus dorsi muscle yourself. If you have flat feet, you should start with static exercises to tone the muscles and restore the ligaments that will support your foot. The static load will look like this. That is, you sit on a stool and make such a movement inside the foot. You can do this with both feet at the same time. Make a movement inward. One foot presses on the other foot. Hold the pressure somewhere for about 3 seconds and do from 5 to 10 repetitions. Begin with static exercises in 2 to 3 approaches. The first thing that needs to be done is to work out the large gluteal muscle itself. Remove the areas of tension in it. And second, start. Exercise statically. That is, you strained, hold for 3 seconds, and relax. The foot movement is like this inside. At the same time, the knee should not move. The knee stays in place. This is what you need to start with. The first exercise to start with for training the gluteus maximus muscle is static load on it. The movement itself will be like this, inward. In this case, the knee should remain stationary. It should not move along with the foot. Only the foot makes such a movement inward, and it's more convenient to do this simultaneously with both feet. That is, you've pressed and relaxed, pressed, hold for 3 seconds, and relax. That is, both feet are trying to make such a movement inward, but they interfere with each other. That is, it gives an aesthetic load on the large gluteal muscle. Such a movement. Make sure that the knee does not move during this. Do from 5 to 10 repetitions. The next stage of training the gluteus maximus is an exercise with a rubber band. The first type of exercise is when you fix it, make a loop and put it on your foot and do an isolated movement with your foot. Here is the first type of exercise. In this case, the foot should be slightly extended, and you make a movement with your foot inward. At the same time, the calf muscle contracts to the maximum. Here is the second version of this exercise. It's a bit more difficult, but you can use it when you have nowhere to attach the rubber band. You can use your second leg for this. Here, choose the number of times in such a way that the first time you start with the moment you just felt fatigue in the muscles, stop right there, take a rest, because you need to remember that you are training a weakened muscle. Here's another option that you can do while sitting. The principle here is the same. Some people might find it more comfortable to do this because it's easier to isolate the gluteus maximus when the foot is on the floor. This is approximately the amplitude in which this movement should be performed. The most important thing is not to move the knee during this. And the next stage of training, the gluteus maximus, should only be moved on to when you can easily perform these first few variations, because in this case, the load on the gluteus maximus is maximum. Here you need to hold all your body weight, lift it up here, place your foot in such a way that it stands on the edge, for example, on the toes or the border. Lower the inner elbow down and lift it up. But I repeat once again that this exercise should only be done after you have already easily started to perform the first two. You can't try it right away because you'll just injure the muscles. They won't be ready for such a load. This is the most difficult of all the exercises for the gastrocnemius muscle. In all exercises, you need to be very accurate, follow so as not to injure the muscles during the exercise. You need to remember that you are training a weak muscle that has not worked for you for a long time. And therefore, if you felt pain, if you felt any discomfort here, you need to stop this exercise, and here, this exercise is shown without shoes, but it is much more comfortable to do it in shoes.